filming Philip Martin's presentation, and then it will be over, okay? So don't you worry. We won't be filmed the entire time, okay? So, because this is something that we would like to set on the internet, that 1 hour talk, because then that should be more informal and, yeah. Okay, so, thank you, Philip, for coming again. Thank you, Aisha, for doing the presentation and the moderation today. Thank you, all of you coming, and let me add something else. Philip Martin speaks German, as we just figured out this afternoon. So he said that he would do his presentation in English, and then afterwards, if you feel like you would like to ask the questions in German, please do so. No problem. Yeah. Okay, so I hand this over now to Aisha.
Thank you very much, Rika, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome also from my side. My name is Aisha Babajan. I'm working for the Department for Integration of the City of Stuttgart, and I have the pleasure to moderate this transatlantic talk about refugee crisis in Europe, challenges and opportunities for migration. As you all know, this issue has turned into a crucial test for European politics in the past year. On the one hand, we have this humanitarian and civil protection policy. On the other hand, the closed, open door policy actually by some European states, but also in the US. This issue was decisive throughout the whole presidential election, and that's why I'm happy to moderate this session. And again, a warm welcome to Professor Martin, and I would like to welcome our distinguished guests from different institutions, like the Ministry for Social Affairs and Integration. We have from the Welcome Center Stuttgart, actually the Regional Economic Development Corporation, the Chamber of Commerce and of Industry and Commerce, and the City of Stuttgart, represented by the Commissioner for Integration, the Social Affairs Department, and the Welfare Department, and of course our special guest, Professor Philip Martin. Please allow me to introduce him. Mr. Martin is Professor Emeritus of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California in Davis. He is currently the chair of the University of California's Comparative Immigration and Integration Program. Mr. Martin has done a lot of research actually on prospects, for example, for Turkish migration to European Union between 1987 and 1990. He evaluated the effects of immigration on Malaysia's economy and its labor markets in the mid-1990s, and he assessed the options for dealing with unauthorized migration into Thailand. So, Mr. Martin, you are known as an effective analyst who can develop practical solutions to complex and controversial migration and labor issues. So, you're the right person at the right time to be in Stuttgart. And we are very glad to have you here with us, as we are going to talk about the core issue of integrating migrants, and of course also about Trump, the new president. Both the US and the EU are the major destinations for international migration. We'll talk about the figures later on. We know that there are differences in terms of how Europe and the US integrate migrants, especially with regards to the integration, to the access to the labor market. In Germany, we have the belief that the immigrants are integrated faster in the US with regard to the labor market than in Germany. Maybe it's because of the first job policy you have. And we would like to know this evening if this is a success story, or do you also face challenges with this approach? And we all remember the statement of Ms. Chancellor Angela Merkel last year, when she said, well, wir schaffen das, we'll manage it. We would like to know how you would assess the immigrant and refugee integration in Germany. So, this is just for now. Before we start do a short round of introduction. So if you can just say your name, your function, your institution, and maybe one question or one issue you want to raise this. Okay, maybe we'll start with Mr. Schäfer.
Thank you very much. My name is Ralf Schäfer. I work in the Department of Social Affairs and Integration, and I'm responsible for integration and the labor market, especially the acceptation of qualifications which were made in foreign countries. Thank you.
My name is Verena André. I'm working for the Stuttgart Region Economic Development Corporation, and we have a cooperative project, a Welcome Center in Stuttgart, right here next to us. And it's the first contact point for professionals from outside Germany, skilled professionals, but also newcomers to Stuttgart. And we are also focusing on how to integrate skilled professionals to companies and address companies with services. So that's my field of interest, and also with your presentation.
My name is Bernd Engelhardt. I'm Managing Director of the Chamber of Commerce. One of the most important duties of the Chamber is vocational training. We are the authority for the vocational training in Germany, and so we are involved in the integration of refugees in the labor market.
And my name is Steven Sparrow. It's the big bird, no, the small bird. And I'm the head of the Social Welfare Office of the City of Stuttgart. We are responsible for housing the refugees in the last year for more than 1,000 people, refugees from all over the world. And we are also with colleagues, with Mrs. Münz and Mr. Pavkovic, we are responsible for integration. That's the next big step for the next 2 years.
Gary Pavkovic, I'm the head of the Department for Integration Policy in the City of Stuttgart. So the big challenge for us is not only integration for newcomers, for the asylum seekers, but also how we deal with the moods, with the Stimmungen of Gereiztheit in Germany. We have polarization in the civic society, similar like in the United States or Britain. Britain first, make America great again. German first. All what you do for the Syrian refugees. We are the old Germans. So the question for me is how to deal with these moods. We have narratives of belongingness to include the new Americans and the old Americans. It's a big issue for us in Germany at the moment.
My name is Angelika Münz, and I work in the planning department of the Youth Welfare Office in Stuttgart. My task is to develop pathways into labor for young people, together with the colleagues here, together with the labor office and the job center. And I have the pleasure to be part of the delegation to the United States in April of this year. It is part of the transatlantic exchange program of Welcome America, together with the World Foundation.
My name is Ido Matic. I'm also here from the Chamber of Industry and Commerce. I'm my boss, Mr. Engelhardt. As you already told us, the chambers are responsible for vocational training here in Germany. And we, in the Chamber of Industry and Commerce in Stuttgart, have established a so-called service center for vocational training, especially for migrants and also for refugees, where we try to convince the young people who come from abroad, also the refugees, about the advantages of doing vocational training.
So, thank you very much. Professor Martin.
You see my little slide said that what wasn't studying migration, but I went to Washington to work for a think tank called the Brookings Institution in the late 1970s. And we had a president then named Carter, and he was an engineer with a plan for everything. And one of his plans was to deal with illegal migration from Mexico. And one of the solutions was to learn from Germany. And instead of letting people come illegally, we were going to bring them in as Gastarbeiter. And so I was asked to study this, and I wrote a paper and basically said it's much easier to start temporary worker programs than to stop them. And we did not get a guest worker program, but I did then move over to the White House and work for about a year and a half. And I usually tell my students that when we started working on this unauthorized migration issue in the U.S., we had about 3 million unauthorized foreigners in 1980. Today we have about 11 million. So just because you work on something doesn't mean you make it better or solve it in any way. What I'm going to do is, in my 20 minutes here, cover just a couple of quick topics. The first is that the United States is the country of immigration. So the U.S. has about, it's actually a million higher now, 43 million foreign-born and people. And the main takeaway is 1 out of 5 international migrants in the world is in the United States. So we're about 20%. Germany's actually number 2, and about 11% of all the world's international migrants. Then comes Russia and a few others. So the first point is we are a country of migration. The second point is that we have a different policy when it comes toward integrating people. And what we do is we don't, most of you, if you're in the United States, Chamber of Commerce people would be there, but all of those with integration offices, you wouldn't even have a job because we don't have integration office. They say the genius of integration that's right. The genius of integration in the United States is there is no integration policy. That is, you come and you make it on your own or with the help of your families and stuff. And so the idea, we're starting from conceptually different places. We're starting from a place in the United States where the theory has always been if you come to what people call the land of opportunity, you make it on your own, not with the help of government. I'll just say a word about the election near the end, that basically the thing to remember probably about the United States is whites always vote majority for Republicans. That's been true for a long time. Blacks vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, like 90 to 10, 90% of all black. And then Hispanics and Asians vote about 2 to 1 for Democrats. So about 2/3 of Hispanics and Asians vote for the Democrat, about 1/3 vote for the Republican. So what made the last election unique is that the share of whites voting for Republican, which is always about 55 or so percent, went up to about 58 or 59%. And the black turnout and the Hispanic turnout was lower. And that's what allowed these 50 separate elections to tilt in a way that most pollsters did not really see. I'll talk at the end a little bit about what Mr. Trump might do. So just a few words about migration. Today's a typical day. There will be a little over 205,000 foreigners who come into the United States today. And about 3,000 of them are what we call immigrants. And the immigrants mean you get a visa. It looks like a credit card, but it used to be printed on green paper. And we often still call immigrants green card holders because for many, many decades, the piece of paper they got was green. And the basic idea is 3,000 people a day get this card that allows them to become a U.S. citizen after 5 years. They can work in pretty much any job. The biggest number, of course, are 200,000 what we call temporary visitors. And they're mostly tourists, but they're also business visitors. We have 1 million foreign students. We have probably 1.5 million guest workers. So there are people in the U.S. for a particular time and purpose. Generally speaking, they're supposed to leave, not all of them do. And then we've been running about 2,000 illegal or undocumented slip across the border from Mexico, and the other are the people who come legally and then don't leave. And just as for many years in Germany, maybe when people talk about migrant workers, they're thinking Turks. So in the United States, when people talk about migrant workers, they're often thinking Mexico, even though Mexicans are only about 28%, about 30% of all the foreign-born people in the United States. And the way to think about it is, in 1970, when Mexico had 50 million people, about 1.5% of all people born in Mexico lived in the U.S. Today, 10% of all people born in Mexico live in the U.S. So the corridor between Mexico and the U.S. is by far the biggest in the world. The second biggest corridor is from India to the United Arab Emirates. And so the Mexico-U.S. corridor now is about 12 million, and the India to the UAE is about 4.5 or 5 million. So the doors, we talk about a front door for legal immigration, a side door for the visitors, and a back door for the unauthorized. But perhaps the big thing to think about is that it's a family unification-based system. 70% are coming because somebody already in the United States sponsors their relatives to come in. And what happens is that the United States has the world's most expansive definition of family. So immediate family means the spouse and children up to the age of 21 and the parents. So what that means is we get a lot of people coming to the United States who, let's say, have a 40-year-old, so we have take a typical case, a Chinese student who comes, graduates, gets a job, and stays. After 5 years, becomes a U.S. citizen, and now marries somebody from China or somebody in the United States, has a family, sponsors his or her parents. So now we'll have the parents coming in at, let's say, age 60. Then we also have a system that allows that perhaps now 40-year-old Chinese to bring his or her brothers and sisters. What that means is there's a long waiting list, 20 years, to bring in your adult brothers and sisters. Many people don't wait. So when you get your immigrant visa, you're normally already in the U.S., often illegally in the United States. You come as a tourist and you overstay, and then you change your status. So immigration means, you think of fish in a pond. They're already in the pond. They're just changing their color. They're going from, you might be a student, then you might become illegal, then you might become a student again or something like that, and then you might become an immigrant. So people are constantly changing status until they eventually get the immigrant thing. So we've got this idea that we're a nation of immigrants, and there's an important distinction between the two major sources of immigrants. So a little over half of all immigrants come from Latin America, and about 30%, 35% come from Asia. And here's the big difference. The average Mexican-born person in the U.S. has less education than the average person in Mexico. Okay, so who's coming from Mexico to the U.S.? It's the rural poor. The average person in Mexico has 9 years of schooling. The average Mexican person in the U.S. has 7 years of schooling. So, the majority are low educated. But from Asia, it's the exact opposite. The average Indian-born person in the U.S. has at least one advanced degree. The average Indian does not have one advanced degree. So the same with China. So from Asia, we say this is a positive selection. In thinking now about the U.S. system in Europe is, immigration in the United States is associated with work. So there is no integration office per se. I mean, some cities have. But immigrants are a bigger share of the workforce than, in fact, the labor force participation, the share of immigrants who work, is higher than the share for U.S. born. The unemployment rate of immigrants is lower. It partly reflects the lack of a social welfare state. It partly reflects what people are coming for. The gap in earnings disappears once you hit the college level thing. So we're mostly going to talk about low-skilled migrants, because high-skilled migrants, as in Silicon Valley, are Indian, and they start a lot of companies. They typically come as students, they graduate, they stay on. So if you ever go into the Silicon Valley thing, there's very strong Indian, very strong Chinese are associated with hard work. So we have a lot of agriculture, we have a lot of construction, and normally, if you think about agriculture, about 75% of all people who work for wages in U.S. agriculture were born in another country, usually in Mexico. And so when people see they're different colors, but agricultural worker is the #1 occupation of foreigners in California, Oregon, Washington, and a lot of the West Coast states. Housekeeper or janitor is the #1 occupation in a whole other state. So in many states in the United States, I think the #1 occupation this is, remember, all people born in another country, is usually a low-skilled job. And the work is often visible. So in building bridges, as Mr. Trump says he'll do, though the people building bridges are typically have to have a certificate, work in construction on houses for painting and for building and for roofing, there you don't need a certificate. And those people are overwhelmingly people born in Mexico or El Salvador. Born in Latin America, there's no certificates that are needed. It's essentially a network hiring system where a Salvador, in some cases, they're not near what they would be on a regular project. The sector with the highest share of low-skilled migrants is agriculture. But the sector that employs the most are hotels and restaurants, because it's a huge sector. And that's where we have not just Latin Americans, there's a heavy representation of Asians as well. But agriculture often stands out because there's agriculture in every state, and the workers involved are often fairly visible. That is, on average, they're having 8, 9, or 10 years of schooling. How do you integrate them in the labor market? And the U.S. answer is private sector. In and you get a job. That's what you want. And most people are coming in order to get a job where they earn more money than they would at home. So we'll stand up in front of the TV and say, if it weren't for my good Mexican workers, I would be out of business. If I can't build the houses, if I don't have the workers here to build them. And they say, I'm glad I'm not out in the sun picking tomatoes when it's very hot. I'm glad I'm not up on the roof doing it. And the fourth thing it does, parents I've interviewed from rural Mexico who say, I know I'm never going to make it up the American job. So the U.S. system is get them into jobs, and that has the children. In Europe, it's different because it seems to me that especially with your asylum seekers, the first point of contact is usually a social service agency, staffed by professionals who are good at identifying the need. Bring the people, our clients, up to a level where they can slide into this labor market. And of course, that means that the money from the taxpayers' money starts going out the door from the very beginning. It also means that you're investing in the newcomers to bring them up to a standard. But the question then is, how are you going to move them from tax-free benefits to taxable low wages? Because for some people, the incentives might not be very high. And if you look at sort of how it could play out, in the United States, we have what we call working poor migrants. So remember, migrants are more likely to work than U.S.-born citizens. But even if they work, health insurance are often tied to your work, you can wind up having a low income and very few benefits. In Europe, you get sort of the opposite problem, which is non-working migrants. So the ones who do get jobs get good jobs. They get regular jobs and they get benefits. But the question is, how do you wind up getting enough people into the labor market quick enough before, or while they still have incentives and before there's kind of a backlash? A couple of years ago, the idea in Europe was, let's have contracts, so, tough love contracts. If you don't learn the language, like in the Netherlands, I don't know if Germany did, Switzerland talked about it, maybe we don't renew your residence permit. The big thing that runs through all of the talk about helping migrants in the U.S. is ABC. Over and over again, you bring people into a room and you say, a job leads to a better job, leads to a career. You're starting down here at the bottom of the labor market. You came from a poorer country. It's still a higher wage than you could have gotten at home. But getting that first job will lead to a better job. It may not, but that's the mantra that is being preached. So the integration lesson from the United States is that immigrants get associated with work. And remember, you never have an issue with high-skilled migrants. There are issues with high-skilled migrants on getting their certifications recognized right away and stuff, but in general, we have relatively few issues with high-skilled migrants, and I don't think too many countries do. The big issue is low-skilled migrants, and what do you do to ensure that they get integrated very quickly? The U.S. line, and you hear politicians saying this all the time, is think of a ladder. And the idea is supposed to be the United States welcomes people who want to climb the ladder with their hands, but not people who have their hand out asking for any kind of benefits. That's why, generally speaking, legal immigrants are not entitled to any federal benefits until they have worked 10 years in the United States. Now remember, they can become naturalized citizens after 5 years, so it's effectively a 5-year bar. And the expectation is that one thing that works everywhere in Europe and the United States, the best integration policy, of course, is full employment. Because if employers are seeking workers, that's going to make integration much easier. But the issue becomes when people do have difficulty getting into jobs, what exactly do you do to help encourage them to get in? In the United States, the policy really is to have flexible labor markets so that, remember, in the IT branch, most people working in IT do not have computer degrees, right? In fact, there is no standard. So in fast-growing sectors, so medicine is an example of something that's highly regulated and difficult to break into. IT is an example of something that's not highly regulated, and that's one reason people say it's easier for some people to get in. But it is the idea is the combination of more flexible labor market and then the theory of uplifting them. You know all about the European story, so let me just end with a few words about migration and Mr. Trump. So immigrants in the United States, remember, are two distinct groups. A little over half are less educated Latin Americans. About a third are well-educated Asians. And in 2016, Mr. Trump, Mexican immigrants, it was mostly directed against Mexico. And what he did was he wound up saying that he would do 3 things on migration if elected. One is he would build a wall on the Mexico-U.S. border. The second is that there's about 2 million foreigners in the United States who were convicted of U.S. crimes and are therefore subject to deportation, but who are people. And then the third thing is that in the United States on migration, cities vary enormously in their policies toward migrants. Some cities and some states, like in California, give ID cards to unauthorized foreigners. The University of California accepts unauthorized or illegal foreigners to the university and gives them scholarships. So the policies vary a lot. If you go to Arizona, which is a neighboring state, the policies are much tougher. They don't let them into the university. They don't give them ID cards. We give driver's licenses to illegal foreigners. So the cities and states that protect unauthorized foreigners are called sanctuary cities. And what Mr. Trump, the third element of his campaign was to end any federal money to sanctuary cities. He can't do all of it, but he can do some of it. But the main thing he focused on is the wall. So Mexico and the U.S. have about a 2,000-mile border, and about a third of it is fenced. And that's roughly what the fence looks like. That man is in Mexico, and you can see it's a fairly big fence. And when he gets to the top, you'll see that the wire goes into Mexico, so it's going to be a little hard. What you don't see there is there's people who will rent him blankets and ropes when he gets to the top to get over the wall. So what Mr. Trump has said is he's going to finish that wall. It's about 1/3 finished now, and he's going to make Mexico pay for it. And so to end sort of what primarily from Latin America, they're not all illegal. In fact, most of them are legal. But there is it's by far, that's what makes the U.S. unique among industrial countries in having about 1/4 of all the foreign-born people be unauthorized. So as you're driving, guys, people come in and they try to cross the big freeway, and pretty much once a month we'll get people who get killed because that's the kind of people we've always taken. They're dreamers. They want to take advantage of opportunities. If you're against it, you say, no, that's those people. It could be terrorists. Same year, having two entirely different cover stories. One of which says, absorb them. The other of which says, build a wall. And so the component in the United States versus the fact that in Europe, many of the newcomers are legal applicants for asylum. So that's a big sort of difference. But the main overall difference, or the main little education, and the challenge is figuring out how to get them into the labor market. The U.S. policy is put them in private sector jobs and let employers, families, the private sector integrate. The European policy is a much heavier dose of governmental involvement. And we will have to see how this plays out. It's not as if one approach is the United States. It probably would make sense to have a more active governmental role in many cases. For Europe, it may make sense to think about different approaches to encourage migrants to seek work, and more importantly, to encourage employers to take a chance on migrants. And whether it's in the form of an entry-level sub-minimum wage or a wage subsidy or some other thing, all those ideas have been tried under different circumstances for special groups with both ends. Let me stop there, and hopefully we can have a useful discussion about which way forward.